All right. Welcome, everyone. Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, wherever in the world you are joining us. Thank you for joining. We are from the Azure Cache for Redis team. I am Shruti. I'm one of the product managers, and I have a guest with me today, Philo, who is our lead architect on designing some of the client interactions and the client experience for the Microsoft Entra authentication feature that we previewed a few months ago. As everyone understands, passwords are not great for anyone to maintain, and everyone desires to have a state of applications where no one wants to care about passwords, and that was the major motivation for us when we did this Microsoft Entra based authentication for connecting to your Azure Cache for Redis. So today we'll be talking mostly around how do you configure your client applications to connect with your Azure Cache for Redis instance, and then how do you use managed identity, like a system assigned managed identity or a user assigned managed identity, and then how do you connect to your Redis cache with that. So, just quick things before we move on. You can reach out to us anytime if you have any questions, comments, suggestions using the email address that's mentioned on the slides. And then we are also on Twitter at Azure Redis. That's our handle. You can find all of our past community calls as well with the AKMS/Redis community calls link. And pretty much, if you have any questions, any suggestions, you could also drop them in the comments. This is a live session, so we are here looking at the comments and responding to your comments as well. With that, I think those were the few things that I wanted to talk about, and I won't waste any more time and hand it off to Philo. The stage is yours, Philo.
All right. Thank you, Shruti. And welcome, everyone. Thanks for joining us today. As Shruti mentioned, I'm Philo. I'm an engineer on the Azure Cache for Redis team, and I will be showing you a demo today of our new Microsoft Entra ID authentication for Azure Cache for Redis instances. So we have support for a few different scenarios for using Microsoft Entra to authenticate connections to a Redis cache. We do support, as Shruti said, managed identity. So system assigned managed identity or user assigned. Those are the two I'm going to show you today. In addition, it's also possible to use the service principal to connect or even use default Azure credential, which is another popular way to integrate into the greater Microsoft Entra authentication system. So how it works at a high level, as you may know, Redis connections, normally when you create a Redis connection, you will specify a password. And for Azure Redis, we use an access key that is generated for you and is associated with your cache. And when you create a connection, you'll pass in that access key. You can also pass in a username, not usually necessary, but those two pieces of information is what we use for our Entra ID authentication. So the key point there is that you could use one of those different types of identities that I mentioned, including managed identity. You can use that to request an access token from Microsoft Entra. And when you create your Redis connection, instead of a password, you will supply the token that you retrieved. That's your password. And then for the username, you pass a string that identifies the identity that gave you that token that you're using to connect to the cache. So in that way, we're able to kind of piggyback upon normal Redis authentication, but kind of sneak in the ability to use Entra to create those pieces of information. So demo-wise, specifically what I'm going to show you today is those two managed identity scenarios in a .NET Redis client application running on an Azure VM. I'm showing you .NET because that's a very popular tech stack for our customers to use connecting to Azure Redis. And we've also built an extension package for the most popular .NET Redis client library. The popular library, of course, is Stack Exchange Redis. And we have an extension package for that now that handles a lot of the token management for you when you're using Entra ID to connect. And it works very closely integrated with Stack Exchange Redis to handle a lot of the tokens and refreshing tokens all automatically. So that's the scenario that we'll see today. But at the end, I'll also point you to support for other types of client libraries and other languages, including Java, Go, Python, etc. So to start with here, as I said, we're going to use an Azure VM connecting to Azure Redis Cache. So we're looking at right now, this is my portal view of the cache instance that I've created for the demo. You will be used to seeing access keys. These are what I mentioned. More importantly, though, we can flip to this preview tab for Microsoft Entra authentication. And you'll see that I have already enabled Microsoft Entra authentication, which you can do as you create your cache. So that part's all configured. Now what I want to do is move over to the data access configuration blade. And because I'll be using a managed identity to access this cache, I need to add that managed identity. So I'm in the Redis users, and I'm adding a user. This user will be a data owner. So you can see different roles have different permissions as far as the Redis commands that they can execute. For the purposes of this demo, we'll start with the owner who can do anything in the Redis cache. I'm going to use a managed identity. I will select it from my subscription. I have user assigned managed identity, and conveniently I have only one, so I'll select that. That's fully selected. That looks right. I'll review and assign, and there we go. So that's being created. The next piece, so this is the cache, and we're configuring that. It'll take a moment. You'll see there's an operation in progress to configure that user. And now I'll switch over to the VM where I'm going to be running my client code. So because I'm using a user assigned managed identity, I need to basically register that with the VM also. So I'm in the virtual machine experience. Under security, you have this identity view. You can have system assigned or user assigned, and this is where I need to add that same identity that I just granted permissions to the cache. I also want to add it on the VM. So now the VM is going to be authorized to use that identity in applications running on the VM. So that will also take a moment, but as you can see, now that's been added. So what's next? We will create a project. So this is going to be a C#.NET project. I'm using .NET 8. And this is just a very simple console application. We'll start by just clearing the boilerplate code. So completely fresh start. This is going to be a very basic application, but we will start by adding a reference to the NuGet package for our extension package, which is called Microsoft.Azure.StackExchange Redis. Whoop. Yep, there we go. This one here. So this is the one that I mentioned that extends Stack Exchange Redis and adds a bunch of token management capabilities along with other things. I will accept. And now if I flip back to my code, we'll start kind of in the middle. If you're familiar with using Stack Exchange Redis to connect to Azure, you will know that it's all about the connection multiplexer. So we start by creating a connection multiplexer.
Philo, can I ask you to zoom in a little bit, please?
Oh yeah, sorry.
Perfect. Thank you.
You bet. Yeah, so you'll see now that we've referenced connection multiplexer, we've got this automatic using reference added to the whole Stack Exchange Redis namespace. I am going to call a static connect async. So you've likely used this before, and And you're probably familiar with the fact that you can pass in a connection string here. That's probably the most typical usage. The connection string, the important parts are you need your Redis host name and port. 6380 is the SSL port. And then normally you'd need a bunch of other the details to specify your access key, passwords, other options. So we're going to switch it up a bit. We're not actually going to use this string overload in this case because we want to use the extension package to manage tokens. The way we plug that in is actually using connection options, which is another type that's provided by Stack Exchange Redis. And it's basically a substitute for a connection string. It's more of a strongly typed object that you can specify all the same properties for Redis connection. So that looks like this. And the easiest way to move to using connection options instead of a connection string is to use this parse method, which will take that connection string and then give you an instance of configuration options. I'm also going to call into the extension package here. You'll see these configure for Azure methods. These are all coming from the extension package. The one we're going to play with right now is the configure for Azure with user assigned managed identity. And what this will do is kind of plug in some of those token management capabilities on the configuration options instance that's being created. And then that instance of options will be used for the lifetime of any connection that's created based on it. And that's how we can have our token management code also running for the lifetime of that connection and refreshing tokens as needed and generally keeping the connection happy. So this configure for Azure method here takes a couple of parameters. So what I want to do here is call out these parameters. These are all things that you would want to have coming from your app config generally. So we'll just hard code them as constants here, but so the first one, of course, is that Redis host name that I already tried to use. And my Redis host name, if we go back to the cache, the overview, the host name is right here, so I'll grab that. Oops. Great. And now the other pieces of information that configure for Azure is waiting for include the client name. Is what it's called. Maybe it's client ID. And it's not going to show me. But you'll have to take my word for it. It's going to be client ID. And there will also be a principal ID. And these are both referring to that Microsoft Entra identity that we're going to use to retrieve tokens for this connection. So actually we'll ignore the client ID for now. No, we won't. We'll keep it and we will grab it off of this guy. Points to the owner. Yes. So here I'm looking again in the Azure portal at the managed identity I created for this owner identity that we're connecting with. And in the overview, we have client ID, which I will copy in here. And the principal ID is the other important piece of information in there. So pretend we got those from an app config. They're hard-coded now, but I will pass them in. Yeah, client ID comes first, and then tool ID. Okay. So now that we are instantiating a config options by parsing that and customizing it for Azure, we can pass it in, and now Connect Async will be happy. What is missing here, of course, is code to actually talk to Redis. So I'm just going to copy paste that because it's not nearly as interesting. Oops, maybe I won't. So what we can do is grab cache is actually a property on the connection itself. The cache is what we'll be sending data into and getting it out of. And, oh, missing an await, a classic mistake. This is the fun of doing live demos. There will be mistakes, so keep a lookout for those. Now I can call get database to get a hold of my Redis cache. I'll be operating on, we'll just hard code a key name. Oops. We'll start with getting a piece of data, a single key. That looks like this. This is all the same as you would expect to see if you were using any other authentication form, including the traditional access token. So we'll output the key that we get. Oops.
You need to set the key first.
Good question. I'm not going to set the key first in this demo.
Okay, sorry.
No, I should have mentioned. So the experience that we'll have here is we're going to get a key that does not exist yet. So what we should see is an empty value returned by this line here. And then, of course, we can set the key and verify that that works. So let's cheat a bit. We'll copy some code. We'll change this into a string set async. Same key. We'll just put a string in it, and then we'll also output it as the intended value, and then we'll get it again and make sure that this line outputs the actual value, this new value that we put in. So if I did everything right, this has a good chance of working now. Let's try it out. Running the application. Is there an error? There is. I can't declare value twice. That's fair. All right, running for real. Oh, it worked. All right, so we see this first get. It's very small. It's brand new empty cache with no value set, so we got nothing for the key. Then we set it. Oh, I should have, obviously I have a code bug in there, but we'll ignore that. There we go. The good news is that at the end, when we re-get the value for the second time, now it has an actual value in it. So that all worked well. That's showing the user-assigned managed identity with basically this single line of code that does the hookup to connect to the cache using an Entra token coming from this user-assigned managed identity in Entra. I also promised that I would show a system-assigned managed identity. So let's see what that looks like. So system-assigned managed identity, you may be familiar with, that basically picks up the identity of whatever entity in Azure is running your client code. In this case, it's this VM that I'm in. Normally, you would not be running Visual Studio on an Azure VM that is executing your application and connecting to Redis. I am in this demo just because I wanted to skip the deployment stage. So it's important to note that you can have client code running on an Azure VM like I am here, but you could also have it running in an Azure web app or an Azure function or any other Azure type resource that can run your application code. And all of those types of resources, I think, will support using a system-assigned managed identity. And the way that works is on that entity, the VM in my case, I have turned on system-assigned managed identity, which gives me this principal ID. So if I want to start using this to connect to the cache, I can copy it, and we will paste it in over this. So now we've got system-assigned managed identity. What's interesting, you'll notice, is that when we change this, the system-assigned managed identity, it no longer needs a client ID. It only needs the principal ID. So we'll grab that and pass it in. It doesn't need the client ID because it's implied that it's the machine that we're running on is the client. So that's all good. We've got the code updated. Now we need to also make sure that the cache knows about this VM and the VM's identity is able to access. So what we will do is add its identity. For the VM, so we said the system assigned identity was an owner. For the VM, let's make it just a reader. So it's got a restricted set of permissions, maybe more closely matching how you would set up your app instances to run in prod, where they have this scoped down set of permissions. So I selected reader. I'm selecting a managed identity. I can select a virtual machine. That seems promising. And this is the machine I want. And I will review, and looks good. Assign that. So again, this will take a couple minutes to complete. Meanwhile, let's update the code a bit. We can fix this log statement. Oh, and we should also put a different value in there. So we know that that works. So that's what we want to happen. And all right, we're still saving the identity config, so I can't run quite yet. Any questions have come up yet or thoughts?
I think we're good. No comments at this point. Can you go back to the portal? We can talk a little bit about access policies here. So if you look at the access policies, there's 3 built-in access policies right now. That's the reader, contributor, and owner. But these are just some of the common ones that we think most developers would need. But if you're not aware, these permission strings that you see, the @all and all keys, those are actually based on Redis open source concepts of ACLs, or access control lists. So you can always create your own custom access policies if you want. I'll drop a link for how Redis actually defines access keys. Access control list. That is what this permission strings are based on. So you can always create your own custom access policies to allow, say, for example, if you have a message broker application, if you want one of your managed identities to only publish and one of publish or subscribe from a specific channel, you can have any type of custom policies assigned for your applications here. But for the demo purposes, we are just good with the existing built-in policies. And if those work for you, that's great. But you're always free to choose or create your own custom policies here. I think that is Meshfield. I think that got us enough time for provisioning the
Yep,
access we needed.
it
Perfect.
looks like it did. So let's go back to my VM and we'll try to run this now using the system assigned managed identity. All right, let's zoom in. So you will see this time we got an exception. Fortunately, this is a planned exception during demo. And you'll remember that we chose to configure the system assigned managed identity with read-only permissions. So what's happening is it's able to get the value that we set using the other identity. But then this call to string set async throws an exception, specifically no perms, no permissions to run the set command or its subcommand, because the read-only role doesn't have permissions to write into the cache. So this is showing that we are in fact using a different identity, and that identity has a completely different set of roles, much restricted. So that is everything I had to show for the .NET sample. Hopefully that has been illuminating and as simple as we could possibly make it. So as I mentioned, this call into the extension package is hooking up additional capabilities for Stack Exchange Redis to manage the Entra token, including refreshing it. Of course, tokens expire. Usually 24 hours, I think, is the default expiration, but your Entra tenant can be configured for a different expiration. Tokens expiring would be a problem because a couple of factors. So when you're using Redis, you want your Redis connection from the client to the cache, you want that to be as long-lived as possible, because any disruption to that connection will result in possibly failed commands where Redis commands throw exceptions to your client application. And reestablishing a broken connection can take some time. So it's important that you keep a single connection to Redis alive for as long as possible without any interruption that could result in failures. So what this token management does in the extension package is proactively refresh the token before it expires, and then re-authenticate that existing connection by passing in the fresh token to the Redis server. And that is necessary because without having always having a fresh token, the Redis server will actually close your connection if the connection was created with a token that is now expired and has not been refreshed. So generally you want to request a fresh token and re-authenticate several minutes or hours before the token is going to expire, to give yourself some leeway to make sure that your connection is never dropped by the server. So those capabilities are built in. For .NET, it's very simple. The story for Java, Go, Python, etc., is slightly more complex, but only because we haven't provided an extension package for any of these client libraries. This one's covered, these others are not, but we have sample code. So if you're using one of these libraries in one of these other languages, you can simply grab some of the code and include it into your application itself. So your application will be responsible for managing the tokens and refreshing them and re-authenticating connections. But that code is actually pretty straightforward. So what we're looking at here is specifically the sample that was linked from this other page. This is the sample for the Java Redis client library. And I'll just walk through it really quick to kind of illustrate what's happening and how it's not a ton of code to add into your client application to enable the Entra scenarios. So at the top here, you see this is pretty standard stuff of creating a Redis client. However, we also have this helper class here that takes your Redis connection and would take a username, a managed identity, and will manage the tokens for you. And essentially, so what happens here is this is just sample code working with the cache. But if we dig into the create Redis client call that happened, this is where we actually new up Redis instance and configure that with all the normal details. But down below for the token refresh helper class, this is where it gets more interesting, interacting with the identity, Microsoft Identity Client Library to request new tokens. So you can see that there's a call to get the access token. This call happens on the first establishing the connection, and then also on refreshes. So you'll get a token, and then it schedules a recurring task down here to refresh periodically. And the refresh interval is defined based on the token expiration minus some minutes or seconds. And then the task itself will do the work to, here we go, call get token on the token that was initially passed in. And get token is what gets the refresh token and keeps the connection alive. So definitely take a look at this sample or one of these other samples that applies to the client library you're using to see exactly how that works and how it would hook up in your application. But it should be pretty straightforward. The Microsoft Identity SDK does give you a good head start there with making it very easy to request the tokens. You just have to decide when to do it, and then make that fresh token available to re-authenticate connections or to create new connections. And I think that wraps it up. Shruti, anything else that we should cover?
No, I think you covered it all, Philo. Thank you very much for your time and joining us today for your community, for our community stand-up. And for all the audience, please go try it out. And I know we are in preview right now, but we are gearing towards making this feature generally available in the next few weeks. So please do try it out. You can always, it's available right now to try it on your caches. And if you have any feedback or any suggestions or questions for us, always reach out. We are available at Azure Cache-PM at Microsoft.com. You can always drop an email or feel free to comment here as well. Thank you, Philo, for bringing up the slides. Yes, this is exactly what I was talking about. So yes, feel free to reach out with any questions, suggestions. And thank you all for your time. Have a great rest of your day. Thank you all.
Thanks all.